Before we begin this podcast, I'd just like to point out that there are spoilers. Lots and lots of spoilers. An early title for the podcast was to be Spoilers Galore, if that gives any indication of the amount of spoilers. It helps if you've seen these movies. If not, I do suggest giving them a view to fully appreciate this conversation of ours. The topic was chosen by Carl and is the satire of propaganda. My particular choice was a satire that was used as propaganda, meaning that I may have missed the point slightly. However, we strive for contrast within a theme and look for how one movie can shine a new perspective on a very different movie. It's all about context, meta, and if nothing else, a tenuous way into talking about these films. Anyway, enjoy. Hello, and welcome to this first episode of Screenanalysis, a new podcast series in which we analyse the silver screen. My name is Daniel, and I'm here with my friend Carl.
Hello!
And Carl, what is this podcast all about?
Okay, so movies and film are the art form of the 20th and 21st century. This is an incredibly important way of looking at ourselves. We use movies to define ourselves, to define our culture. Our identities are built up in these things. And they're incredible works of art. We put huge amounts of time and money into creating and watching these things. But most of us don't really understand the language of film. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about or learning about this as an art form. So we have about a century of film behind us now, so this would be a great opportunity to start looking at movies and analyzing these in a deeper, more meaningful way.
I'd also like to add that this is not a review show. As Carl said, we are here to talk about a century's worth of film, and one of the films that we're talking about today is from the first half of the 20th century. And we're not here to give these movies a score. These are not current movies. We are here to look at the techniques that directors or writers use, how these films are put together, and just the general construction of the movies as a whole. We're going to take a different theme each week, and within that theme, we are going to compare two movies that we feel are relevant. And so, what are the movies that we are looking at today?
All right, so the theme that we've chosen for this episode is the satire of propaganda.
And I have chosen The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin. What's the movie that you've chosen to look at?
I've chosen Inglourious Basterds, written and directed by Quentin Tarantino.
Okay, so let's have a look at what is propaganda. In terms of film, what is propaganda?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to understand about propaganda, and again, we'll go into this much deeper on a later episode, is that it doesn't challenge your view of the world. Good, effective propaganda presents you with a view of the world that you kind of want to cheer on. You want this to be a reality. You get aboard it, and then while you are on board with what's going on, a message gets passed to you, a value gets passed to you. Maybe the villains are a certain kind of person, or they're doing a certain kind of act, or maybe the heroes are doing a certain kind of act or a certain kind of person. But effective propaganda always gets you on its side first, and then slides you the message without you really realizing it. And I think that's a really important thing to understand when you start looking at the satire of propaganda, where we take that propaganda and we start turning it sideways so that the message gets foiled. And you shouldn't confuse satire with comedy. I know that's something we usually see. When someone says satire, we're thinking, oh, we're going to make fun of it. Sometimes it is.
Well, I mean, a lot of satire in one of its pure forms is to deliberately poke fun at the establishment.
And that's great fun, but it's not the only way of satirizing something. So what would you say a propaganda film is?
Propaganda is a very wide and open thing. There is no clear propaganda genre, I would argue. A lot of propaganda comes out in the form of documentaries. Certainly, if you're looking at Second World War, this is the kind of propaganda we're looking at today. A lot of the propaganda around the Second World War came out in the form of documentaries. There's the very well-known Nazi-produced propaganda movie Triumph of the Will, which documents Hitler and a lot of his Nuremberg rallies and really states him as a force. In a movie like Triumph of the Will, propaganda is creating this state, creating these ideologies, and maintaining them throughout the documentary. There's no real crisis, there's no real conflict, but there's a very clear point of view that is impressed upon the viewers the entire time. We are looking more at fictional movies. And as I say, there's no real genre. We are looking at... Inglourious Basterds is a war movie, whereas The Great Dictator is, although it has war as a background, there is no actual war. So this is much more of a personal conflict between the two main characters. But what often happens in fictional propaganda movies is that the state, the ideology is created, but there are often miscreants, there are rebels, there are deviants, choose whatever word you want, who often challenge or go against the established set of ideologies. So if we look at not so much a war movie, but Reefer Madness from the 30s, this was a film backed by religious organizations, and it is warning of the dangers of drugs, particularly pot. So there we go. The ideology is that drugs are bad. And throughout the movie, we see a lot of drug takers, and the influences of pot have very terrible effects on them. So, they become rapists, they become suicidal, murderers. So, the message is drugs are bad, and these rebels, these miscreants are punished.
As opposed to, sitting there watching Teletubbies and giggling while trying to tie your shoes. Yeah.
Or actually watching Reefer Madness whilst high and laughing over stupidity. That's certainly how most people watch the movie, I believe. But conversely, we have movies like Battleship Potemkin, where, because the point of view is different, the rebels are actually become the heroes. So in Battleship Potemkin, the movie takes place in 1905. So this is before the Russian Revolution. Battleship Potemkin was released in 1925, after the Russian Revolution. But throughout the film, the soldiers on the battleship, the seamen actually, are given this disgusting, revolting meat, just full of maggots, and they get angry and, just start revolting and going against the state. And although they are challenged as the movie goes on, there's, scenes of soldiers firing into, squares on public, but these soldiers refuse to do that. And ultimately, the state tries to take them down, but when the soldiers acting for the state actually get there, they don't fire on these particular seamen. They treat them as heroes because in 1925, these seamen who are revolting, who are being revolutionaries, they're ultimately supporting the post-revolution ideologies. So, propaganda movies can have very different points of views, sometimes saying that this set of ideologies are good, sometimes saying this set of ideologies are bad, and effectively maintaining that set of ideologies throughout the film, and particularly in fiction, they can get challenged, and again, depending on the point of view, are either punished or welcomed as heroes. Is there anything else you would like to say about propaganda?
No, that's very clear. But I think it's important to remember that today we're not talking about propaganda.
No.
We're actually talking about the satire of propaganda. So it's taking the idea of propaganda and turning it sideways so that the audience gets a look at all the parts underneath it. It's a way of diffusing propaganda, and making people aware of what's going on.
Yeah, and by bringing satire into the equation, basically we are looking at a set of values and mocking them,
Yeah.
laughing at them, saying that these set of values are bad. Okay, so shall we begin with The Great Dictator?
I think that's the perfect place to start.
I mean, what is most interesting, before we get into the satire propaganda stuff, I mean, this is his first talking movie. Arguably, he does some gobbledygook in modern times, but this is the first movie where there's real dialogue, and he's removed himself from the tramp character. In this movie, he's playing two parts. He's playing the part of a Jewish barber in the ghetto. He's also playing the part of Adenoid Hinkle, which is basically Hitler. And kind of that's one of the reasons why he wanted to do the movie, is because, well, Hitler looks like Charlie Chaplin. Certainly with the toothbrush moustache.
We should make that clear. Everyone wants to say Charlie Chaplin looked like Hitler. It's not true. It was the other way around. The mustache was Chaplin's.
Mm-hmm. So basically, this movie was made in 1940, and it is propaganda because it was Chaplin's attempt to get America into the war. By this point, obviously, Britain was already fighting. There was definitely a war going on. But this was Charlie Chaplin's message to America to get involved, to try and show some of the atrocities that's going on in the war. And so basically, we see the Hitler character getting ready to invade Austerlitz, which is basically Austria. A lot of names have changed. You'll probably pick up on the puns as we go along. I'm not going to explain all of them. But we see Hitler, Hinkle, getting ready to invade Austerlitz. And to do that, he needs a loan from a very prosperous, rich Jew. So, beginning of the movie, he's sending the stormtroopers into the ghetto. They're terrorizing the place. But when he's trying to get money, the stormtroopers are really nice all of a sudden. That loan's denied, so the stormtroopers go back to being bad, and he finds out that, I forget the name of the character, the Mussolini character, Napolini, the Italian dictator, has already put troops around Austerlitz, so we go towards the end of the movie as the two try and debate, negotiate invasions of Austerlitz. On the other hand, we have the Jewish barber, who, at the beginning of the movie, we see him in the First World War. He manages to save a German pilot who will later play big prominence. But as a result of a plane crash, he is put into a mental institution for many years due to memory loss. He eventually manages to escape from the mental institution and has no idea what's going on. This is 1940-ish. He has no idea what's going on, and so continually gets into trouble with the stormtroopers for not knowing who Adenoid Hinkle is, or the regime change, or anything really. Basically, as a result of his companionship with the pilot Schultz, who becomes a main member of the Nazi Party, because of his friendship with Schultz, he gets into a lot of trouble. Both of them are arrested and put into the same concentration camp, and basically they manage to escape, and confusion abounds about identity. Basically, the Jewish barber gets mistaken for Adenoid Hinkle at the end of the movie. So, I mean, is that a fair summary?
Yeah, no, I think that covers all the points.
But any thoughts, any notes going into this?
Just some broad observations. I thought the humor was really interesting to watch. This was very much, I felt, Charlie Chaplin kind of clinging to the silent era. There was a lot of action and humor that would have been unchanged in a silent movie. A lot of humor in even contemporary movies was driven through dialogue, and you had a few little scenes where they had a clever line, or the punchline would be delivered by a line, but most of it was very visual, very straightforward humor. That's not a bad thing, but it's very reminiscent of an era where you could not communicate humor through dialogue. You had to see it happen on the screen.
Yeah, as I've mentioned to you previously before this, Chaplin resisted making talking movies until he couldn't get away with making silent movies anymore, basically. So the first talkie was in 1927. This movie was released in 1940. He held out for 13 strong years.
I admire his gumption, but I'm kind of glad he came over to the other side.
Yes and no. But I mean, again, even though this is a talking movie, he has a lot of dialogue. A lot of this is in gobbledygook language, particularly when he's stressed or angry or coming across with some political message. I think the gobbledygook was partly intentional, that he wanted to, satirize Hitler. And basically make, Hitler's words into just this garbage language, this meaningless language. Of course, there's a lot of humour. One of my favourites is satirising Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, where you see Hinkle at a Nuremberg-style rally. He's speaking the gobbledygook, but, it's blah, 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 blah. Austerlitz, blah, 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 blah. Europe, blah, 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 blah. The world! Clearly, he's talking about invading all of these countries, but there's a narrator who's obviously reading from a pre-prepared manuscript, and the narrator basically says, Hinkle has peace in his heart for all people.
A disconnect from what we're told he's saying and what he's clearly saying, which, lovely humor, absolutely wonderful stuff. You could really see the venom, though. There was a lot of venom in that humor, which it's Hitler. He deserved it. I'm not arguing against that.
Well, we both spotted a particular scene with the microphones.
Oh yeah, wonderful sight gag. I immediately thought of Looney Tunes. It's very cartoony in its nature, where he's just screaming into the microphone and the microphone wilts backwards the way a human being would.
The suggestion being there, from my point of view, is that's how venomous his words are.
Yeah.
But even the microphone has to wilt away.
Right.
So, a lot of the focus on Hinkle is, more traditional, let's say, satire.
Right.
He's continually made to look the buffoon the entire time, whereas the Jewish barber character, there's a lot less satire going on. There's a lot more conflict in the barber's world, where, he is struggling, and, there's certainly moments of humour, but it's not satirical humour, it's good-natured humour.
It's good-natured. He's always trying to do the right thing and be noble and be on the right side.
And by doing so, he's flying in the face of the Nazi regime.
Oh, of course. Yeah, no, it's a great example of the innocence versus the venom of the Hinkle character.
But coming back to my observation on propaganda, he's going against the regime. He does get punished. Now, this is a little bit more of a Hollywood film. He has eventual success. But a lot of the way through, it is following that particular mold that I set out for propaganda films. Right. In that, he's getting punished. He gets hanged halfway through the movie. The stormtroopers tie him up by the neck from a lamppost. He's saved by the German officer Schultz. But, he's continually getting into trouble all the time. If anything, Hannah, the love interest, is probably the bigger instigator of trouble. She's smashing stormtroopers over the head with tiles and frying pans or whatever comes to hand.
I actually lost count of how many stormtroopers she smacked upside the head with a frying pan, yes.
But she's the one who's really flying in the face. But again, she's effectively exiled. It's a self-exile. But they have to leave. They have to leave Tasmania, the name for the fictional country that they're based in. So on one hand, we've got more of a propagandist approach. Now, obviously, here, this is an American movie, so the propaganda is showing the atrocities of what the Nazi regime is doing.
Right.
But telling it kind of through German eyes. Because, the Germans are the state. The Germans are the authority. Obviously, the Jewish barber gets the ultimate victory, so, it's pulled back and, Americans get to, well, actually, probably even the Brits, arguably, because at the end, Schultz has a very strong British accent. Chaplin is British. He can't avoid his British accent. Arguably, it's two people with British accents that are the ones who save the day almost.
Right.
But it's a propaganda movie.
Well, there's two things going on here. On the one hand, it's a satire of propaganda. It's sending up Hitler's speeches. It's sending up Hitler. It's sending up the Third Reich. And this is very much a comedic satire of propaganda. But at a deeper level, you're absolutely right. This is in and of itself propaganda. Although it's not, I think, sanctioned by the American government. It's definitely sympathetic to the Allied force.
It's been a long time since I read any of his autobiographies, but he had a lot of problems trying to make this movie because America was definitely not interested at the time. He produced it by himself. He had his own studios. I think, I could be wrong, I think he effectively self-financed this one.
He self-financed it, and it paid off for him because that meant he had fewer investors.
Mm-hmm.
This was his most profitable movie. So he got to reap the benefits.
Yes, he did. Well, I mean, I think you've got a list of questions,
I've got a few questions. I've got something. So one of the things that I noticed, and I was kind of hoping you might shed light on this. Now, Chaplin plays two roles in this. He plays the Jewish barber, the hero of the story. He also plays the Hitler character. Mm-hmm. Now, there's an obvious plot contrivance towards the end where you get a prince and pauper thing where they switch roles. Aside from that, do you think there was something deeper going on, some kind of message?
Jewish barber is much more reminiscent of a tramp.
I caught that with the umbrella and the
I mean, he wears slightly better fitting clothes than the tramp does. The tramp notoriously has a very tight waistcoat with very baggy trousers. And, particularly during the First World War sequence, I mean, that could have been Shoulder Arms, for crying out loud. Shoulder Arms is a 1918 movie he did about the First World War, where he's like picking up the grenade, accidentally dropping it down his trousers, wiggling it out. In my notes, I actually, later on in the movie, when things are calmed down, I actually wrote it in the notes, when things are settled down, Charlie Chaplin can get back to being what Charlie Chaplin does. For example, with Hannah, he wants to move in more into the beauty parlor business. And so Hannah is selected as a test model, and they're talking about being absent-minded, and, well, he starts shaving her face, basically, putting on all the lather and getting the knives ready. Neither of them notice, but that's Chaplin being Chaplin. There's another moment where he's, again, in the barbershop, maybe even the same scene, but there's music going on. And all of his movements are to the beat of the music. I mean, little things like that are just Chaplin through and through. So I think I think you're right. I think the Jewish barber was there, because again, the Jewish barber, to my recollection, let me just check, it's not given a name.
Yes, he is. He's given a
name. According to Wikipedia, it's just the Jewish barber, which again has parallels with the tramp, this nameless figure. So I think it's a bridging technique to get people interested and into the film. I mean, he kind of wears similar clothes to the tramp, not completely, but similar clothes. So yeah, I agree with you. I do think it's a device to help people get into this propaganda movie that he's making.
Okay, so is there... obviously, he had a message. As this functioned as propaganda, what do you think Chaplin is telling us, or trying to tell America, about Hitler? What was his message? What is his propaganda?
Are you talking about the very final speech, or just throughout the movie?
Well, throughout. What do you think?
Well, he's making Hinkle out to be a buffoon, and a useless buffoon, somebody who's obsessed with his own power, but is effectively useless. There are many comparisons to Roman emperors. He's even called Caesar at one point. There's a running gag of him whenever he gets a spare moment, he goes into this little room where there's two waiting artists, one doing a portrait, one making a bust. But of course, he can only ever get 5 seconds at a time. He's in this huge office room with this one little desk, all things designed to show power. Of course, the famous globe scene.
Right.
There's a very clear message there. He's bouncing this globe around. It's basically a balloon, and he's bouncing it around. At some points, he's holding it, not quite like Atlas, but it reminds me of Atlas, where he's holding the world in his hands. He's playing with it. And then the world pops. There's a very clear message there. Hitler's going to destroy the world.
Okay.
But again, it's all this vain ego, power that he's got going on. There's continual battles of power with, for example, Garbage, the Goebbels figure. I mean, Garbage is telling Hinkle what to do the entire time. The Napolini. I mean, there are continual power struggles going on with Napolini, and Napolini's always the one who wins out. Even with Herring. Herring bends over at one point, knocking Hinkle, knocking him over. It's whatever this guy tries to do, he's just unsuccessful. Even at the end of the movie, they've set up this whole plan to foil the Italians into getting into Austerlitz, where he's going to be on a boat pretending to be on a duck hunt, but by firing that shot that's supposed to signal the beginning of the invasion, Hinkle himself is the one who gets captured. And yeah, as I said earlier with the gobbledygook, that's Chaplin portraying Hinkle as just talking meaningless BS, basically. Chaplin's message about Hitler is avoid this guy. He's a fool. He doesn't know what he's doing, and he's just an egomaniac. I mean, there was a quote from Chaplin later on that had he known about the concentration camps, he would never have made this movie. Because basically, the concentration camps really put a very different twist on Hitler. I mean, once we know about the concentration camps, this is just an evil person.
It becomes a lot less funny.
It becomes a lot less funny. Yeah. So there was he made it in that very tiny little piece of time when he could still make fun of Hitler. Send him up, satirize him.
Do you think it was effective? Do you think that this helped sway the American opinion?
Probably not.
Certainly, it's not mentioned in the American history books. It's all Pearl Harbor. That's what brought.
Absolutely. I think it might have helped bring some awareness, but I am not sure how aware the Americans were of what was going on. This might have been very common knowledge, at the time. I mean, of course they're going to know who Hitler was. Of course they're going to know that Germany and Britain are at war with each other, that Hitler's invading all these countries, France, Belgium, going into Austria. Of course they're going to know all of this. So, and how much more information really does it give about Hitler than that? That's surely must have been common knowledge. So Chaplin's giving a very personal spin on who he believes Hitler to be. The raids on the ghetto. Maybe that was not common knowledge in America.
I think a little bit yes and no. It's difficult to get really clear historical records because in hindsight a lot of stuff gets swept under the carpet and you get a certain view of history, but there was a lot of support for the German state in America
and in Britain as well, unfortunately.
Really up until the war was declared. A lot of Americans were saying this is a European problem. This is a territorial dispute. This is not something that America should be involved in because it wasn't seen as a humanitarian issue.
Don't forget, and I kind of want to talk about this a little bit with the next movie that we're going to talk about, but, a lot of Germans left Germany to go to America. A lot of German filmmakers, they're going to be, spreading their messages around. So coming back to your question, how much awareness did he raise? How much impact did he have on getting America into the war? Probably not that much, but every voice counts.
Okay. One last big question. Now, according to your own definition of propaganda earlier,
Yep.
is this a propaganda film?
Yes.
Explain, please.
There's a clear intention to highlight the terrors going on in the ghettos, to destroy Hitler's image, and, well, I mean, there's that big long speech at the end, for crying out loud. At the end of the movie, the Jewish barber is mistaken for Hinkle as he escapes from a prison camp, and they're at the Austerlitz border. Why you would have a prison camp so close to a border, I've got no idea, but
Some of them were actually very close.
maybe. But they meet with the German army. They're dressed as Nazi officers. Everybody thinks that the Jewish barber is Hinkle. Hinkle's obviously out of action at this point in time, and he's asked to go on stage and talk to the world. Well, certainly Germany, but, well, Hannah hears his message. She's in a different country, so yeah. And he spreads this message of peace, of pacifism, basically, of love. Now, that kind of leads into your point a little bit. It's not a hidden message, certainly not, but you're brought into this movie, and at the end, yes, there is the message. Very clear, very obvious, and a lot of people criticize it for being sentimental. I don't know your thoughts on that.
The speech at the end?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little sappy, but just to offset the rest of the movie, I think you kind of need it. It stands in very stark contrast to the Hitler-esque speeches that Hinkle was giving earlier on.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Where you have this relatively soft-spoken man imploring people to just express their humanity.
Mm-hmm.
You're not machines. You're not animals. You're men. That's a really, really distinct message. It's a big about face, and it's the last moment of the film.
It is.
So that's what people walk away with. So it's a little bit on the nose in terms of propaganda.
It's earnest. It's definitely earnest.
But in terms of propaganda, I don't actually think that was the propaganda. That was what functioned as propaganda.
No, there's a conflicting message here. Obviously, he wants more involvement in the war, but at the same time, I think he's talking to his European counterparts who are fighting. And so this is not just a for Americans movie. This is for the world to see. So I think that speech, because it is talking about pacifism, I think it is more aimed at, well, the only people who can really have any kind of control, the European leaders in this. Now, of course, Hitler's not going to listen to this.
Oh, although he did watch this movie.
He did, yep.
Yeah. Twice, apparently.
I think he found it amusing, didn't he?
Well, it was banned in Germany. It was absolutely banned, but he did have a copy brought to his palace. He did watch it twice. He had 2 screenings of it, so he couldn't have hated it that much. Yeah, I don't know if he found it amusing. I can't imagine he did, because it's not a subtle send-up of him. It's rather quite on the nose, and at the same time, he was quite a Chaplin fan before all of this started, so who's to say?
But yeah, so that final speech, it is conflicted in its nature. But yeah, coming back to the propaganda point, I mean, it's just warning of the horrors, the atrocities that are going on, and
well, I think the propaganda here is, from the audience's point of view, you sympathize with the Jews in the ghetto.
Mm-hmm.
You identify with their plight against the stormtroopers, and you laugh at Hitler, and the Nazi high command. So the value that's getting spread across here is the people being persecuted are sympathetic. These are people you should be helping.
Yes.
And the people doing it are both evil and buffoons,
And should be stopped.
and should be stopped. So in terms of propaganda, it's not exactly subtle.
I was going to ask you a question, actually.
Sure.
How subtle do you think a propaganda movie can get away with being?
The best ones are very subtle. The best ones never seem like propaganda. The best ones just get put into the canon of film. And
Then let me rephrase that. How on the nose do you think a propaganda movie can get away with being?
Well, apparently pretty on the nose if this is a propaganda film, because this is a very blatant mockery of Hitler and Nazism.
Okay, so I think I should just point out there that the battery on my recording equipment died. So if it seems like an awkward cut, that's the reason. But was there anything more that you had to say about the Great Dictator?
I think I covered everything that I needed to talk about. I liked this movie.
Yeah. It's a very enjoyable movie, certainly. There's a lot of darkness behind the movie in terms of the basically what the movie's talking about. There's a lot of darkness that is kind of skirted over, particularly with the concentration camps and the Holocaust that was not yet known about. And there's just a lot of general nastiness that was not brought up, but I think the movie was still effective enough to, to get its message across.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's important. Anytime you're looking at a movie about the Second World War that was made during the Second World War, you have to remember that they didn't know as many things about what was going on as we do today. And we've formed a very, very particular historical view of the Second World War that was still kind of ongoing at the time. So there's a lot of elements that we said, well, why didn't they talk about this? Well, some of those things they didn't know about. They didn't know about the Holocaust. They didn't know what was happening in those concentration camps. You could make a few guesses, but the reality of it was absolutely overwhelming when this story broke.
Well, one thing to point out is this film went into production, or certainly in terms of writing, pre-production, in about 1938. And at that time, Britain certainly still at peace with Germany, so Britain was not interested in releasing this movie. But then the war broke out, so, kind of anything goes. And the Brits really welcomed it. The British government really welcomed the movie into the UK because of its messages, because it was a useful propagandist tool for them to satirize Hitler, to bring him down.
Yeah, kind of free advertisement.
Yeah, basically. And it was one of the most popular movies in the UK upon release. I mean, I think it was like the second most popular movie in the States upon release, and yeah, very similar position in the UK as well.
Yeah, this was a very, very successful movie.
Came out in France in 1945, but it still became one of the most popular movies there as well. Yeah. So, even as the war's closing or as the war's finished, this movie still has a lot of impact for a lot of people at that time.
There are some wonderful stories that you can dig up about reels of this movie being smuggled into Germany-controlled Europe. Contraband.
Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on to our other film, which is Inglourious Basterds, directed by Tarantino, no doubt written by Tarantino as well.
I'm pretty sure written, directed. Not starring this time, which is nice.
Well, he doesn't star in a lot of his movies.
No, he often takes a role here and
yes.
there.
So, what is Inglourious Basterds? How would you summarize this movie?
Oh, okay. This is not an easy movie to summarize. In short, it is about two plots to kill Hitler. A little bit longer. We start the movie in the early days of the war, relatively early days in the war, and this German SS officer called the Jew Hunter, played incredibly well by Christoph Waltz, is hunting down Jews in the French countryside to pick them up, shoot them, or send them off to the concentration camp. Long story short, one of the young Jewish girls that he's hunting down escapes and runs off into the hills, and this would come back to haunt him and to set up our story. Years later, she is living in Paris under an assumed name, and this young German soldier comes up to her and starts asking her questions. He finds out that she not only works at, but she owns and manages a movie theater. Well, being a movie buff, this German soldier asks her questions. Are there going to be any German movies here? And tries to flirt with her unsuccessfully. Finally, this SS officer shows up, takes her away, amazingly, to this lunch meeting with the commander of German propaganda, Goebbels. There we go. Thank you. Had a moment of forgetfulness there. Yes, Goebbels. There she finds out that this young soldier is actually a war hero and has starred in the movie about his epic stand against a horde of American soldiers in this small town where he sat in a bell tower as a sniper and shot 300 enemy soldiers. Goebbels produced this movie and wants to show it in Paris. And this young officer wants this movie to be shown in this young woman's theater.
Yeah, this is a film premiere, right?
This is a film premiere, yeah. This is going to be some big propaganda event. And a lot of the German high command is going to be there. So eventually she doesn't have a choice. It's decided she's going to do this. And of course, at this moment, Landau, Christoph Waltz's character, shows up. Turns out he's been promoted to chief of security for this event. So she's looking at the man who tried to kill her, who murdered her family in front of her. And she's terrified that he suspects that she is one of these escaped Jews. It's a beautifully tense scene. So once it's decided that this is going to be the theater, she sets out a plot to blow up the theater on the night of the premiere, thus killing huge numbers of the Nazi high command and having her revenge. At the same time as all of this has been going on, we have the story of the Inglourious Basterds. And this is a group of American soldiers, Jewish American soldiers, who have parachuted into Germany and are going around just killing as many Nazis as they possibly can.
Not even just killing them.
Killing them and scalping them. Wanting to make this iconically American, so do the old Apache ritual of scalping the dead, and branding those who escape with who they let go with a swastika on the forehead, just to make sure that everyone will always know that this was a Nazi soldier. So this is a little intense, and they are met with a British undercover agent,
Archie Hickox.
Archie Hickox, played by the
Michael Fassbender.
Thank you, played by the incomparable Michael Fassbender, Magneto himself. He shows up. There's going to be a plot regarding this movie premiere that's going on in Paris. So he meets with an undercover agent, a German double agent, who is a German movie star. And it turns out that he's meeting her in a basement bar where they're going to find out about this movie and then make plans to assassinate as many high commanding German officers as possible. The Bastards are involved in getting him to and from this village. Of course, things go very badly. Almost everyone involved in that meeting ends up dying in a spectacular scene. The German spy survives, meets with the surviving Bastards, and the Bastards then undertake to finish this plot. Because it turns out that not only at this premiere there's going to be most of the German high command, but it turns out Hitler himself will be there. So this is their chance to end the war. So they're pretty sure this isn't going to work, but it's worth trying. They're going to take the bait. So both of these are happening at the same time. The bastards show up dressed as an Italian film crew with dynamite strapped to them. This young Jewish film owner has rigged the entire building to explode. Anyway, the security officer, Landau, played by Christoph Waltz, figures all of this out. And in the last moment, decides instead of saving Hitler, he's going to make a deal with the Americans to become a war hero. He's going to let Hitler die, and he's going to escape to America and live a very pleasant life on Nantucket. And that's where it actually gets interesting, because in every war movie where something like this had happened up until this movie, it always falls apart. And of course, Hitler doesn't die in Paris while watching a movie. Hitler died in Berlin during the sack of Berlin by Russia. And Tarantino says, no, why bother doing that? Both of these are good plans. Both of them are bound. One of them is bound to work. And in fact, in this movie, both of them work, and Hitler and the entire high command die, and presumably the world war is over. It's done.
Well, yes. And this is an interesting thing in both of the movies that we've selected, Great Dictator and Inglourious Basterds. Great Dictator chooses fictional places with little twists on the actual people's names, but it's all fictionalized. And even though we know who is who, there's that little, I don't even want to call it a safety net.
Adenoid Hitler and garbage.
Adenoid Hinkle.
Sorry.
Yeah, garbage, herring. And in Inglourious Basterds, we have an alternative history. Well, when Leni Riefenstahl was doing Triumph of the Will, she might have been taking an alternative, although very Nazi-orientated view on what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what is the message in Inglourious Basterds? You said earlier that propaganda movies have a message that is, if it's done successfully, is snuck in to the reader, to the viewers or the readers' unconscious mind or even conscious mind.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this is not a propaganda trying to promote one side of the war over the other. This is a war many decades concluded by 2009 when this movie came out. Which is again
another interesting take. Usually, propaganda movies are done at the time things are happening.
Typically, yeah, at the time. Or if they're set in the past, they are actually about something that's going on. So, for example, when MASH, the musical and the movie, hit theaters, it was ostensibly about the Korean War, but it was actually about Vietnam.
Or another example, we talked about Battleship Potemkin. Battleship Potemkin was made in 1925, I believe. So after the Russian Revolution, but the events happened before the Russian Revolution. In 1905, the events of the movie happen. And the basis of that is that the soldiers who are revolting are allowed to revolt, become the heroes, because they match the post-Russian Revolution message.
I don't really see I don't see that happening here.
No.
This is not representative of the Gulf War or any ongoing wars at the time. But I think this has a deeper message about film, about violence in film, and about how audiences relate to film and to the violence.
Coming from the master of exploitation and violence and gore himself. Well, maybe not so much gore.
You know, he gets this reputation as the master of exploitation and gore, and I don't think that's entirely fair. I don't think he's the master of it. I think he's an admirer of it.
He certainly uses it. He exploits the exploitation.
And I think that's it. And I think this is an important distinction, and one that is very important when looking at this movie. He uses it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he's trying to generate it. He's Tarantino is an incredibly well watched film fan. He has seen almost everything, and most of his movies reflect this. Now, whether you want to say he pays homage or sometimes directly rips off existing movies, this can be argued on a case-per-case basis, but his movies are usually about movies. Sometimes he does get into issues, like Django Unchained certainly was trying to get social issue and discussion going. But Inglourious Basterds, I think, is just more looking at film and audiences and the love of film in general. And I think it has a lot to do with the violence that we see and we crave and the kinds of movies that we find it in. I think this movie has a lot to say about propaganda in film.
Are you talking about film generally or media at large?
I mean, you can always expand an argument to say at large, but I would say looking specifically at film.
So is he effectively saying this overuse of violence, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, let's look at how he uses it, right? Every time you see violence in this movie, it's in the early half of this movie, it's horrific in some way. You're not supposed to be cheering for violence.
In the beginning, it's just downright slaughter.
Yeah, it's meant to be shocking.
Yes.
And this is something a lot of people, when they criticize violence in a Tarantino film, often don't realize. He's aware of the effect that the violence is having, and he usually uses it for that effect. So in the slaughter of the hiding Jews in the first scene, it's horrific. And even later on, when you have the bastards just brutally slaughtering Nazi soldiers and scalping.
Which, they're doing this for their pleasure.
Yeah.
I mean, they're killing soldiers because that's their job.
Yeah.
But they're going that extra step for their own pleasure.
And it's very clear that this is quite distinct from most other war movies you've seen in the past, where some people get shot and that was an impressive effect. I'm thinking like Spielberg's.
Okay. I was thinking like Clint Eastwood, where the Nazi soldiers just happen to walk into his gun every time.
Oh yeah, it's magnetic bullets.
Yes.
Yeah, he has magnetic bullets. But they die in ways that soldiers usually die in war, which is horrific, but is usually through bullets or explosions.
Yes.
These guys are beating people to death with baseball bats,
yeah,
cutting their scalps off. This is brutal and graphic in what they're doing.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's supposed to be. And you're supposed to be repulsed by it.
Yeah.
If you're not, talk to someone about that.
These are not the heroic American soldiers from classic Hollywood war movies.
No.
These people are not Clint Eastwood, essentially.
No, but they're supposed to look like it. You're supposed to have that impression of them at first.
Well, you got Brad Pitt. He's the main bastard.
Absolutely.
So again, a Hollywood darling.
Yeah.
Who we are always, or pretty much always, on the side of in all of his other movies. Yeah. Here, this Hollywood darling is in this horrific role.
But yet he's still very charismatic. He's still enjoyable. It's wonderful to watch him on the screen.
But, I mean, I think this kind of comes back to your point now about audiences and the message to the audience is that, yes, this is Brad Pitt. Yes, Brad Pitt is usually the hero in all of his movies. Yes, Brad Pitt is the main character in this movie, but he's the anti-hero, or an anti-hero in this movie.
Anti-hero, yeah. Yeah, there are no nice people in this movie.
So, but yeah, it's twisting the perspective many people have on who Brad Pitt is and the kind of movie that he usually makes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going through the violence. So we've looked at the slaughter, we've looked at the bastards. What are the major uses of violence? I come to the first one that comes to my mind. I'm sure there are others preceding this, but the barroom fight.
Oh yeah, where it's.
I mean, that's much more of a fight for survival.
Yeah, that's just chaos erupting.
Yeah,
that's tensions building. People with guns under the table on both sides,
yes.
And then it just erupting. quite quickly. I think the fight itself only lasts like 10 seconds at most.
Yeah.
And then boom, almost everyone is dead.
Is it 10 seconds? It actually does feel longer than that, but maybe that's because I was so caught up in the movie at the time.
I think that's it. It everything settles really quickly. Most people die.
Oh, it's a huge lot. It's a long scene, and it's a huge, long build-up. But as the tension rises, the pace certainly picks up. And
honestly, the most interesting thing about this scene, or any of these scenes we're talking about, is in fact not the violence at the end that tends to cap it. It's the lead up to that violence, which is incredibly intriguing.
But what I'm talking about here is this is at least a justified use of violence. The slaughter was... I'm from the character's point of view. I'm not talking about from the director's point of view. I'm talking within the film. This is at least justified. This is not slaughter of the Jews because of the Nazi regime. It's not the bastards just being a bunch of bastards. This is people, there's guns pointed at them. This is just, it's them trying to survive.
This is a gunfight.
Yeah.
Pure and simple. It's a gunfight. And everyone on both sides want to survive by killing the other guys. It's just that, yeah.
But then after that, there's another use of violence. We have the German spy, Wilhelm. He's the sole survivor until it's revealed that the German actress Hammersmark is still alive but wounded.
Right.
And you've got Brad Pitt, Aldo, who's negotiating with Wilhelm for her safety.
Yeah.
And he allows Hammersmark to be released, but then Hammersmark kills Wilhelm.
Right. And from a logistical point of view, it makes sense. They're plotting to kill Hitler. She knows that they're plotting to kill Hitler. If he walks, this whole plan is out the window. Her cover is utterly blown. There is no chance that they get out of this alive if he walks away from that. From her point of view, that kid has got to die.
Okay, so again, this isn't a commentary on violence. This is a plot point.
I think this very much is a plot point.
Okay. Well, then let's parallel that later on in the projection room where Mimi is just about to get to the point, the trigger for her boyfriend Marcel to set fire to celluloid. And is it Zola or Vola? I think it's Zola. The guy who's got a crush on her tries to enter the projection room. And what happens there?
It's kind of a weird little scene. He starts by flirting with her, and then he forces his way in, and you think,
he's very aggressive.
Very aggressive. And you think it's going to become that kind of scene, and then she demurs. She says, okay, close the door.
Yep.
And he seems a little surprised by all of this. And as he turns to close the door, and as the gunfire of the movie is covering the sound, she shoots him in the back several times. Yeah,
but again, that's justified. He's made an attempt on her sexually, aggressively, certainly, but with the influence of rape. But also she doesn't want him to escape because that's going to mess up her plans.
Well, remember, too, by this point, she's plotted to blow up the theater.
Yeah.
The doors are already sealed.
Yeah. Zola's going to mess up the plans. I understand why she kills Zola.
Well, the explosives are in the theater, ready to be gone. The trigger's about to go.
Yep.
Zola is dead.
Yep.
So is she. They're all already dead.
Okay, all right. Yeah, because this was the question I was going to ask you. Because Mimi also gets shot. As Zola's dying, he shoots Mimi.
Right.
As you say, everything, in terms of her plotting, everything's going ahead. There's nothing that's going to stop it now.
Right.
So why does she have to die from being shot by Zola? As you said, she's dead anyway.
Yeah, no, it's
ultimately, long term, she's dead anyway. But
the whole scene is gratuitous in the sense that, in terms of final conclusion, it doesn't actually matter. They both of these characters were dead anyway.
Because my point of view, sorry to cut you off there.
Yeah.
My point of view is that Marcel is very much the sacrificial lamb.
Yeah.
Because he's the one who's going to set fire to celluloid. He's just, by lighting the match, by throwing a cigarette on the celluloid, he's principally killing himself, and he's taken that action, whereas Mimi's in the projectionist room. She knows what's going to happen, but she's distanced from that. She's going to die passively, as it were. At least Marcel is able to take that step, that action, that control. So for Mimi to get shot by Zola, I don't understand that.
It reminds me of a little thought experiment, a conversation starter that I once came across, and that's the idea: would you shoot Hitler? If you had a time machine and a gun, would you go back in time and shoot Hitler to stop the Second World War if you yourself had to look him in the eye as you pulled the trigger? Would you prevent this from happening if it meant that you would become a cold-blooded murderer? And it's an interesting little thought to take. Would you do it? And it's not. Once you give it some thought, it's not necessarily as easy a question as it appears. And I think that's kind of what Tarantino is letting happen here. It's this idea she has decided to kill this entire theater full of Nazi high command. And yeah, these are not good people, but there's a difference between planting the explosives and waiting for them to go off and pulling out a gun and killing someone.
Okay, an idea has just come to my mind.
What's that?
Well, from Mimi's point of view, this is a story of revenge. She doesn't know Landa. Landa's obviously the one who killed her family, but she does not know it was Landa.
She was there. She knows it was Landa. That's the whole point of the scene in the restaurant where she has to sit and eat. The least appetizing strudel I've watched someone eat in my life was her.
Okay, I missed that detail, but I mean, this is still a story of revenge against the Nazi regime, more than just Landa itself.
Yeah.
So then, by Zola shooting her, is that the Nazi regime getting revenge back on her for escaping all those years ago, for putting this plot into action? Is it the Nazi regime getting its little revenge back on her?
It's an interesting point, and it's a good question.
Because she ultimately gets the final laugh as she comes out, as everything's on fire, and the screen's gone, and the smoke's there, and the lights casting the smoke, and she's going, ha ha ha! I'm the one who killed you all. This ghostly figure laughing at the Nazis panicking. She's the one who gets the final laugh,
and very much it's her ghost laughing at their death. So that might just have been written in to make that scene a little more poignant.
Yeah.
It's a very Tarantino-esque scene. He, given a choice between a passive death and an active murder, Tarantino usually chooses an active murder just to see what this does to his characters.
True. Okay, we were still talking about violence.
Right.
Any other major scenes of violence? There's obviously... as Landa is basically getting his freedom.
Right. The final scene in the movie. The war's over, or about to be over. Hitler and the entire Nazi high command have blown up in a movie theater fire, and he's made a deal. He's made it to outside of German territory, and he's handing himself over into the custody of Aldo, Rain, and one of the remaining bastards. And as soon as they uncuff him and surrender, Aldo shoots his assistant.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this young German soldier, boom, gone. You'll be shot for this. Shot? Nah. Probably just chewed out. I've been chewed out before. I love that line. And they pin him down and carve a swastika on his forehead so that he can never escape the shadow of his past. And that's the last scene in the movie. That's the last act.
So it's literally how violence impacts upon his life.
Yeah.
For all the violence that he's caused, an act of violence on him is the one that will impact most upon his life.
Yeah. And he gets to walk away. Which is perhaps not just, but that's not always the world doesn't always work out justly.
Okay. Cool. Well, let's move on from violence. I've got about 5 or 6 pages of questions here. I'm obviously not going to ask all of them.
Okay, I'll get comfortable. Shoot.
But we are bringing this in as a satirical propagandist movie.
Yes.
So, who would you say is the main authority within this movie?
That's a good question.
I mean, we see different levels of power throughout, literally to the top with Hitler and Goebbels and the Nazi high command. We see the foot soldiers, the American foot soldiers, the Inglourious Basterds. There is barely any reference to any higher power.
Well, the thing is, and this is important to remember, we are looking at the satire
Yes.
of propaganda. Now, with The Great Dictator, that was satirizing Hitler's propaganda, but it was also in itself a form of propaganda. The Inglourious Basterds isn't so much itself a form of propaganda as it is just a satire of propaganda. And that's really where it gets clever, because, I mean, for years, Tarantino said, I'm going to make a war movie, I'm going to make a war movie. And all of his fans, myself included, we thought, oh, wow, this is going to be like Platoon. If it was made by Tarantino, this is going to be exploitation, this is going to be crazy violent, this is going to be something in Vietnam. And he came out with this. And even then, it's like, okay, well, I kind of see how this is exploitative in Tarantino's style, postmodern wink, wink, nudge, nudge style. And then we got into the movie theater and he tipped his hand. And I have to say, it was this really brilliant moment. There's a scene in the movie, and if you watched this movie at home on a television or a computer screen, you probably didn't get it. It really only works in theater. It's this beautiful scene where you are looking at the propaganda movie, the Nation's Pride, and this is the propaganda movie that was made about Zoller defending the town against 300 American soldiers. You're looking at the backs of the heads of all of these Nazis watching this movie, and the lines of the theater in the movie, they match up to the lines of the theater that you yourself are sitting in. And you realize you're sitting in the theater with the Nazi high command watching this propaganda movie. And that's where it hits you. If you're paying attention, you realize you're watching a propaganda movie. He said he was going to make a war movie. He didn't say he was going to make a movie about war. He said he was going to make a war movie. He meant he's going to make a war propaganda movie. And that's exactly what he did. And sure enough, in that last scene, while the bastards are in the balcony raining fire down upon the Nazi high command, shooting them, the angles that they're filmed at, looking up at them, shooting down with these machine guns, is exactly the same angle that we had in Nation's Pride, looking up at the bell tower where Zoller was shooting down at these soldiers. There's a scene where an American soldier in Nation's Pride is blown out of a window, and you have what sounds almost but isn't quite a Wilhelm scream. Ah! It flies out of this window. And wouldn't you know it, just as the theater blows up, some poor Nazi gets thrown out of a window on the second floor, and he makes this ah sound on his way down. You just watched the flip version of Nation's Pride. And it's really not that different a movie. It's just you're cheering for the other side. He's not making you into a Nazi. He's letting you support the side that you've always supported in all the movies you've watched about the Second World War. But suddenly you have to go back and you have to think, I was watching all of this hyper-violence. I was watching the bastards do these things to these Nazi soldiers. I was cheering as Shosanna planted the explosives. I was part and parcel of all of this. So as I said before, propaganda works not by presenting a message and saying, you must believe this. Propaganda works by creating a world, creating a story that you indulge in. You want this to be true. You want this story to be the way the world works. And the insidious part of propaganda is all those little bits and values, those messages, those ideas, the way those characters in the story get portrayed. That's the insidious thing that works its way into your value system that you don't necessarily realize, but you take it for granted because what you are indulging in is so enjoyable and so believable. You've been indulging in all of this hyper-violence because it was the good guys. But what did you have to accept while that was going on? And so suddenly Tarantino has made you question the entire movie that you've watched, and maybe a lot of movies that you've been watching.
Yeah, this leads me on to a similar kind of question, a similar issue, is that basically, as I was saying, you see the Inglourious Basterds, and outside of a radio message to secure Lander's safety, there is no governing authority, no power beyond them. They are foot soldiers, but they're just acting out of their own, essentially, self-interest. You have Lander, who, switches sides. So, he's a Jew hunter. He's working for the state, but even if he weren't an SS officer, this would probably be the kind of thing he would be wanting to do anyway. He's a detective.
Yeah.
But a dark detective.
He's a very despicable human being, yes.
He's acting out of self-interest as well as the bastards. You've got Mimi, who is acting out of revenge. You've got Zola. A lot of Zola's interests are just glory. Mm-hmm. He happens to be a very talented sniper.
Right.
And, there's the movie's made about him. And he stars in his own movie, but really it's just enforcing his glory. He's not doing this. He's not killing all these soldiers for the Nazi party. He's doing it because he just enjoys killing people. He enjoys being a hero. He enjoys all of the attention that comes from being a hero. So all of these characters are very, very self-interested in their motives. We've already talked about this. This is not a propaganda film in the truest sense.
No, because it's not. You're not meant to come away with a specific set of values. You're not meant to side with a certain political entity or.
No. And as you say, our views upon all of these people are twisted.
Yeah.
So the bastards, they're not the hero American soldiers.
No. They are Inglourious Basterds.
Mimi's not the cheese-eating surrender monkey that the French are unfortunately often portrayed as being. Unfairly
portrayed as being, but yes.
Yeah, and then you've got the SS commander who isn't working, or at the end of the movie refuses to work for the state, as with the other German soldier, Zola. So, in terms of enforcing an authority, this really doesn't happen in the movie. And as I say, at least certainly on the German side, we get right to the top in terms of who we are able to access as a viewer. We get to see Hitler on the screen.
And Churchill.
And Churchill, unfortunately, the one British character's killed off like that. It's quite the opposite from the Great Dictator, where, the two British accents that get to save the day. This is quite the opposite. The Brits are just taken out like that.
But you got to see Mike Myers do his British accent.
Yeah. It's better than his Scottish accent.
Well, someday he'll play a Canadian, and he'll just be able to speak normally.
But there is a continual. Well, actually, I say continual. Let's look at the first half of the movie.
Sure.
And here we do see America as a strong power within this movie. You noticed this. I noticed this. There is a heavy Western
Yeah,
movie theme going on. Certainly in the first half of the movie.
certainly in the first half. Even just that first scene almost felt like a Western movie. Just those beautiful landscape shots and the tendency to see that villain coming from so long away, and go get me some water so I can wash up. It looked like a French Western.
But in the background, the music background has a Western kind of theme. So, even though, ironically, the first scene is about an SS soldier slaughtering Jews, is it ironic? It's not really, because that's what the early settlers were doing to the Native Americans.
Sometimes, yeah.
So, although there's American authority seems to be stamped on this, it's again being twisted as we see an SS soldier doing what settlers could do to the Native Americans. But then I started thinking about that, the Western theme, and yeah, there's a lot of similarities going on here. Western movies are about the spread across to the west of America.
Right.
And what's Germany doing?
It's
spreading across the western part of Europe.
It's true. And you've even got the bastards acting like the Apaches.
Yeah, sculpting people.
Pushing them back and using guerrilla tactics to spread terror.
And so, but then the Americans, I mean, they're moving east. So they're, it doesn't quite work there, but you could see it as, okay, America's gone as far west as it can go, so where's it going to go next? It's going to go back to Europe, back east, and, stamp its authority all over there. You could see the spread across the west of America as, I want to be careful how I phrase this, but it's kind of like a series of invasions. And what you see in the first half of this movie is definitely a series of invasions all the way across the board. So, you've got the Americans, they've landed in Germany, the Germans are moving across Europe, and then it gets very personal. We get to Paris, France, 1944. And there is just this fantastic little scene where, is it Muni? She's in a little coffee shop.
Yeah.
And continually, she's getting German soldiers coming up to her little booth. She just wants a tiny little bit of privacy.
Yeah.
But all the time, German soldiers are invading her space, coming up, talking to her, coming into her booth, sticking their head around, doorways. It's this, a lot of little instances of invasions, both big and personal.
Right.
And, Zola's very big on doing that. He's continually invading her space, literally getting into her workplace. And, she rebuffs him all the time until she realizes that she can get something out of this. But again, right at the end, he aggressively invades her space. So, again, I think coming back to twisting ideas, Tarantino certainly, by referencing the Western genre, by bringing it to a people's attention, whether not specifically using it to bring in the idea of Western people's minds, seems to be twisting people's ideas about, Western movies.
I actually hadn't seen that, but now that you mention it, that there's definitely seems to be a theme of that in this movie. While the bastards kind of take the Native American approach, the fighting back approach. Yeah.
It's a big, heavy one, isn't it?
It is a heavy one. I'm going to have to rethink a lot of this now. What I found from the scenes, a lot of the scenes, especially the ones with Christoph Waltz in it, is they tended to have a game going on where one character suspects that the other character knows that they're lying, knows that they've created a deceit. And it's just a question of how long before they're sure of it. And in the very opening scene, you have this, where you're pretty sure that something's going on, but you don't know what. And Landau, Christoph Waltz's character, comes in makes a big show of being friendly and, oh, don't worry, I just have a bit of paperwork to do, and then starts asking more and more pointed questions, and the farmer starts looking more and more worried, and you realize he's definitely hiding something. And it's just that point. At what point does he realize that he has lost the game? And many scenes are built like this, where you're just waiting for that character to decide that they have and haven't lost the game. This is why the restaurant scene was so wonderful, because you have Shosanna, Mimi, the movie theater owner, sitting there across the table from the man who murdered her family, and he's ordering pastries and he's talking to her very conversationally, and she's just not sure if he knows who she is. And like I said, the least appetizing apple strudel I've ever seen eaten. I've never been that turned off of food as watching her having to eat this pastry while he just sits there and watches her do it. Yeah, it's a movie with a lot of very intense scenes.
It does. But what about the use of music overall?
Tarantino always does some really cool things with music. This might not be his most memorable soundtrack.
No, but my point there is that this being a history movie, or an alternative history movie, a war movie, a Second World War movie, a lot of the music sounds a lot like the kind of music Tarantino uses in a lot of his other films.
Mm-hmm.
But it is very much more contemporary or modern music. This is not the kind of music that people would have been listening to at the time.
Right. This is kind of how I would have expected Tarantino to do a period piece, though. I wouldn't have expected him to really go out of his way to look for contemporary music, like it's properly set music, just because it just seems the sort of thing he would do. He would look for music that would create an impression that would be accurate, not the music itself.
But certainly for me, it pulled me out of the movie.
Okay.
And
I
mean, you were talking about that earlier, when you were talking about the theatre, and you were in the theatre watching the Nazis in the theatre watching the propaganda movie. That pulled you out of the movie, but gave you a perspective.
Yeah.
On that. Do you think the music has the same purpose here, to deliberately pull the viewer out of the movie and to force him to...
I don't think that he's trying to make something as shocking as that moment in the theater later on, but I think there is something like that going on. I think he's trying to give you an idea or give you a message about what this scene is and how this scene feels to these people. This actually gets to a point that's a very tricky choice to make anytime you're doing a period piece. So the traditional way of doing a period piece is you look for music that would be accurate at that time, and you let the characters listen to that music, and then you let the audience listen to the music as well. This is the traditional way of doing it. What a lot of directors have been doing instead is they say, okay, what music would these people be listening to, and what feeling or message would that music deliver to these people? And instead of letting the audience hear that, they play a piece of music that would deliver a similar feeling or thought to the audience, which is a very clever way of doing it. But some people like to nitpick and say, that's not accurate. It's like, well, of course it's not accurate. It's a movie. It has to deliver an impression to you.
Yeah, so very often in a lot of movies, music is used to manipulate the viewer's feelings. Whereas what you're saying here is, instead of manipulating the viewer's emotions, this is what this character is feeling.
Yeah, that's the way of doing it. There were a few times when...
but again, that's kind of distancing, because,
This is not a movie that you were meant to get lost in, though. This is a movie that he wants you to think about. He wants you to think about these scenes. He wants you to think about how the characters feel and how you feel about what they're doing. He wants you to have a little bit of distance in this movie, because if you have no distance at all, you're never going to reflect on it. He doesn't want this to be a popcorn muncher. And it could have been. It could easily have been. And I know many people who watched this movie just as a popcorn munching Tarantino gore fest. And it's a shame, because I think that's exactly what he was trying to avoid. Do you have any other questions about this movie? Anything else you'd like to look at?
Yes.
Okay.
This was an intriguing moment, or couple of moments that came up. Tarantino references Cinderella.
Refresh my memory. At what point is
Okay,
that?
so this is just after the big battle in the bar.
Okay.
And Landa comes in and trying to work out what happens. He realizes that there's somebody's missing, and he finds a female shoe.
The slipper.
Hammersmark's, the German actress's shoe, who's working for the Bastards.
Right.
And, well, later in the movie, he manages to pin Hammersmark down and puts the shoe on her, and it fits perfectly. He's found his Cinderella, the person who got away.
Another one of those scenes where the character has to decide at what point has she lost the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just found it very intriguing that of the whole world of literature and film, he chose to acknowledge Cinderella.
It is interesting, because in Cinderella, of course, as soon as the slipper fits on her foot, this is where she wins the prince. This is where she sheds her past. This is where she lives happily ever after. And this is the moment where Hammersmark is strangled to death.
Yes.
By Max Landau. So yeah, this is that's quite a little inversion. Yeah,
it is. I mean, it just stuck out. It stuck out a lot. No, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about the Inglourious Basterds. So, I mean, let's have a look at the two movies.
Sure.
As a whole. So we got one more directly satirical movie.
Right.
With a very clear target.
Yeah.
And that satire helps the Allies' propaganda. Mm-hmm. Whereas we got Inglourious Basterds, where there is no clear target. Well, arguably, Hitler's the ultimate target. He is killed.
Well, again, I don't think the Inglourious Basterds functions as propaganda in and of itself, but it is a satire of propaganda. And again, the Great Dictator does. The Great Dictator, while satirizing propaganda, is itself also propaganda.
Yeah, Chaplin studied and studied and studied Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will to get Hitler's mannerisms so perfect. And you can see there are many references, particularly in the Nuremberg rally scenes. There's a lot of direct references to Triumph of the Will.
So yeah, I mean, in that regard, there is a distinction between these two movies. One is propaganda in and of itself, one isn't. But both of them do send up propaganda. Very pointedly send up propaganda.
Yes, absolutely. But which one do you think is... I mean, bearing in mind, we're talking about two movies that were made 65, 70 years apart. Which one do you think is more effective in its satire?
I think the one that's easiest to understand will certainly be Great Dictator.
And the fact that we're talking about it so many years afterwards, so many decades afterwards, speaks volumes for the movie.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, this is a cornerstone film. This is an absolutely iconic movie. It's not too hard to understand. With Inglourious Basterds, as I mentioned, there's a lot of people that never realized that he was satirizing propaganda. Whereas with the Great Dictator,
that's because
hard to miss.
Yeah, well, that's because Chaplin had a very clear object in mind, in very clear intention in mind. He wanted. And, you're talking about subtly sneaking messages in. No, Chaplin's just bang, bang, bang. This is my message. This is my message. This is my message. He doesn't attempt to hide his message at all.
No, not at all. He also uses humor in his satire, which is, I mean, that's the go-to method of satire. Whereas the Bastards, the Inglourious Basterds, was not funny in that sense.
There's certainly moments of humour where the bastards are pretending to be Italian, for example. It's definitely moments of humour.
Oh yeah, no, there's moments, but that's not.
It's not a funny movie.
It's so there are some very clear differences.
Yeah, so like I said, I mean, Great Dictator wanted its message to be heard, whereas Tarantino seems to have hidden his message so that I think a larger population can watch his movie and just enjoy the movie, whether they get the message or not.
Would that make it a little more insidious?
Well, I mean, going back to what you said earlier, certainly more in line.
There's a big difference of the world at the time, too. Obviously, when Chaplin made The Great Dictator, the Second World War was ongoing. People were fighting this war. 2009, we don't have an especially violent world.
Parts of it are particularly, but
compared to the Second World War, we have a not especially violent world.
Okay. Tell that to the IS hostages.
There are pockets of the world that I have no intention of vacationing in. Yes, you're absolutely right. There have always been pockets of the world that are at war, that are very tense, but there are fewer than there were in 1940. Europe is not engaged in the act of tearing itself into little bits and pieces.
No, it's not. This was recorded before Brexit. Long before Donald Trump.
So there's not this titanic divide in the world. I mean, remember, in The Great Dictator, there was these very clear lines, political, moral lines of these other guys and what they're doing, and our guys and what we're doing or what we're not yet doing. Whereas in Inglourious Basterds, it's, in 2009, the world isn't even, I mean, the Cold War is over even. There isn't this us versus them in the world anymore. And there isn't really any large point of view to examine.
Well, coming back to the idea of using satire. I mean, satire, you have to have a very clear target.
You have to have a clear target, which is why I think Tarantino chose his audience. I mean, he's satirizing his audience and the kinds of movies that his audience is liable to watch.
But with satire, very often comes along irony.
Right.
And Chaplin uses irony. It's ironic that such a great dictator can be a bumbling fool. Again, this was recorded before Donald Trump. That's ironic. But here in Tarantino, if the audience is the target, then there's a much larger dose of irony in that probably most of the audience are not going to get that point.
No, the audience is probably going to enjoy the violence that he very pointedly set there so that they can examine their own motivations.
Let's bring that up. Because one thing we fail to mention is, in Nation's Pride, what we see of Nation's Pride in Inglourious Basterds. That's the film about Zola, that is the propaganda film that Goebbels produced, that he's premiering in Mimi's cinema, that is so amazing that even Hitler himself wants to come along and support Zola.
Right.
And the German film industry, propaganda industry. But what we see of that movie is just a continual bloodbath, really. It's just we don't really see much. We see flashes of it, or we see the inverse screen when Marcel's behind the screen. We see it inverse. We see a corner, or we don't see the movie clearly. We're not shown directly the movie. We get moments of the movie in the background as the main story of Inglourious Basterds is unfolding, but really, yeah, it's just continual shot, bang, 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 gun, 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 gun.
Yeah.
And, which is obviously the point that Tarantino was making, excessive violence. And what we see of Nation's Pride is certainly excessive violence, pretty much for no need.
Yeah. Pointedly pointless, which is kind of that last scene in the theater is pointedly pointless violence, right? Everything's going to blow up. The theater is on fire. The bastards have dynamite strapped to their legs, but they're still going to take the opportunity to machine gun as many Nazis as they can.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. So I mean, just pointed violence upon pointed violence upon pointed violence, which again is reflective of Nation's Pride. Just pointedly pointless violence.
Yeah, and certainly when the bastards are firing a machine gun into the crowd, I mean, that was by far the most excessive use of violence. And it made me think back to Paris just a little while ago.
Mm.
And, so that scene, unfortunately, has taken on a whole different dimension now because of what happened in Paris. And
maybe we should mention the event that you're referring to.
The shootings in Paris, where terrorists just walked in with guns and just was it a football stadium? Certainly cinema. I forget the venues, but basically where these crowds are, and they're trapped, just like in this movie, Inglourious Basterds, and the terrorists. It's like shooting, fish in a barrel. It was just horrible slaughter. And in Inglourious Basterds, this is 2009. This is way before this Paris event happened, but it was just, to me, the same unnecessary, needless, horrific attacks on people. They're going to die anyway. Why shoot into the crowd?
Mm-hmm. But again, remember, you were just watching a scene where Hitler was ecstatically watching a scene where Zoller was shooting enemy soldiers excessively and pointlessly and giggling about it to himself. So this is again, to be honest, I'm not sure how a lot of people didn't catch it, because that last scene, it paints it in a little thick. It's like, oh, that thing you were just doing watching this movie, that's the thing that Hitler was just doing watching his movie. They're not really separate acts. The only difference is which side of history you were on.
Yeah. But also, it's basically saying that the Americans and the Germans, by doing the same actions, Zola shooting from a bell tower, the bastards shooting into the crowd from an elevated position. Mm-hmm. It's basically just comparing the two sides and going, well, it's the same people. But as you say, it's just whatever side they happen to be on.
Right.
Yeah.
And from the audience's point of view, what difference does it actually make? You're watching violence. You're watching this. Maybe it's wish fulfillment or vicarious living, or why are you doing this? What are you getting out of this? These are questions that I think you're supposed to ask yourself by the end of the movie. This is a movie that exists for self-examination, and that's the point of the satire, is to get you to just stop and think about this movie and think about the movies that you have watched and why you watch movies. And this is a very important bit of conversation that I think a lot of us overlook.
Okay, so what kind of conversation do you think people watching The Great Dictator would be having?
I guess in this case, again, remember this was in 1940, so I think the point here was, see that Hitler guy over there in Germany? Yeah, that guy sucks. Let's get in there and get rid of him. I think that it's much more a streamlined message, much more straightforward. Listen, there was a world war going on.
Yeah, it had to be streamlined. And also, don't forget Chaplin started writing this in 1938.
Yeah.
It was released 9 months after the war broke out, but
He saw it coming.
He saw it coming, but tried to get a movie out there as quickly as possible, hopefully before. I mean, I'm talking, I spoke earlier about how this was Chaplin trying to get America into the war. That, I think his original intention was just to warn people about Hitler first. And the fact that the war broke out as he's making the film, you know, it's just the way it is. So you've got this movie, you're trying to warn people about Hitler, the war breaks out, now everybody knows about Hitler. So what do you do with this movie? Well, continue with it and, yeah, just get it out there. Yes, we all know Hitler's bad. Here's some of the reasons if you didn't know why. And
Mussolini too, let's not
forget.
Oh,
Mussolini too, yeah. So Chaplin definitely saw this coming, but Chaplin also had the benefit of being in the film world. And as I say, there were a lot of German directors and artists who went over to the States. Chaplin would have been able to easily, find out from these people what the hell was going on in Germany leading up to the war. There's slightly discredited now, but there's if you're into this kind of thing as I am, German Expressionism, there's a famous book by Siegfried Kracauer, From Caligari to Hitler. And like you say, it's slightly discredited. It was published in the 60s, I think. Nope, I've got the book in my hand right now. It was first published in 1947. But his point is that across Europe generally, there was a rise in fascism coming, and obviously, it's happened to be particularly in Germany, both politically with Hitler's rise to power, but also in terms of the filmmakers. Siegfried Kracauer's point is that a lot of the German Expressionism movies, very often horror movies, and they were predicting the rise of a Hitler-type character. This is Krakauer's theory. Mm-hmm. And, of course, this came to a real head in Germany, but it was happening in Britain, it was happening in France, and obviously Italy, and a lot of Europe at this time, as you said, in 2 degrees in America as well. And there's a lot of intelligent people commenting on this, what was going on in Europe, throughout the 20s and the early 30s. And, when Hitler did start coming into power, people were like, no, got to get out now. Before, the Holocaust, before, the big war, people were just like, got to get out. And so, again, coming back to America, I don't know during the 30s how much America would have known about all of this. But certainly people like Chaplin have been able to get access to the German directors, the German stars, and, that helped him a lot with his movie. Because he could lend more credence, he could lend more reality, I guess, to this. And, well, that's an interesting point. How real would you say both of these movies are?
Both of them exist in very much an unreal world. Obviously, with The Great Dictator, we've got a world where this utter buffoon is running this country.
I was going to make a joke about Donald Trump there, but
yeah, well, we'll see how that works out. there's great absurdities in the world of the Great Dictator, and in Inglourious Basterds, there is this hyper real, hyper violent world that they inhabit. They take a lot of liberties with history, like killing Hitler in a theater in Paris, blowing him up there. But where the Great Dictator lived in a world that was kind of absurd and silly, the Inglourious Basterds lived in a world that is brutal, utterly brutal.
But still exaggerated nonetheless.
Very much exaggerated. Yeah.
So do you think both filmmakers needed to exaggerate these worlds to get their points across?
I don't think they needed to, but I think exaggerating these things is a way of emphasizing their points. The humor in Great Dictator emphasizes how inappropriate Hitler was as supreme leader in Germany.
I'd argue there's two different worlds in The Great Dictator. Because you got the Jewish barber as well.
Yeah, but the humor there was charming. He was charmingly humorous.
Yeah, but my point here is that as the Great Dictator, as Adenoid Hinkle, even the physical world around Hinkle is conspiring against him.
Okay. There's the magic reality of the microphones when he's screaming.
But there's also the another example. There's also the train scene when Napolini's arriving by train, and they're trying to put down the red carpet. Napolini refuses to get out with the red carpet, and Hinkle wants press to take a good photo of the two of them, and there's all this tension there, but every time they think they can put down the red carpet, the train moves and shifts back and forth. So conspiring against Hinkle to give Napolini the welcome that he wanted, and certainly get the photo that he wanted. Another moment is with the chairs. They're having a battle to try and sit on a higher chair. Certainly Napolini's chair is cut, the legs are cut off, so he's sitting very low. But if we go to the barbershop, where they have the pumps and they can lift and raise the chairs up, Hinkle gets very exaggerated, very excited, and lifts his chair practically up to the ceiling, and he, it's like, okay, Hinkle's finally winning. Then what happens? The chair conspires against him by breaking, and he sinks right back down to the floor. And those are just a few moments that stick out, but there's quite often within Hinkle's world moments where the physical world is conspiring against him, whereas that happens much less with the Jewish barber. It's the regime that conspires against him, but he seems a lot more at peace with this world. So Hinkle's world is very, very exaggerated, whereas the Jewish barber's world, it just feels a lot more real. It doesn't feel exaggerated. I feel like this is the ghetto, and this is a fair representation of the ghetto.
Okay.
It doesn't feel exaggerated.
Well, he also wasn't trying to send propaganda messages about the ghetto. He was trying to send messages about
and so this is the thing. By having the Jewish barber in a much more relatable world. Oh, this looks like the world that I live in. By having a Jewish barber in a much more relatable world, he is more relatable. And by putting Hinkle in such an absurd world, that distances people from Hinkle, so they are able to laugh at him even more.
Okay. With Inglourious Basterds, I think it's definitely violence. This is a hyper-violent world. The Bastards existed there as it's supposed to be indulgently violent. You're supposed to have a little bit of fun with this so that later on you can look back and feel bad about yourself for having enjoyed what you did and maybe being a little bit shocked as you go along. But keep in mind, units like this did not really exist. The Inglourious Basterds, the lot of them would be tried on war crimes.
Oh yeah,
like this was not fair war, and this was brutal. This was pointedly pointless violence that these people were indulging in.
We have acknowledged that the Inglourious Basterds are Jewish American soldiers.
They make a very clear point of that when you first meet them. Yeah.
And do you think that, again, there's an element of revenge going on here?
It's a revenge fantasy. The whole movie is revenge fantasy. Yeah. I mean, Shosanna has reasons for revenge, and she indulges in a revenge fantasy and actually gets to do it. The bastards are there as revenge fantasy, getting even for what the Nazis did to the Jews, and they succeed in what they're doing it. I mean, everyone who wants vengeance gets it in this spectacular and terrifying way in this movie.
Okay. I can't really think of anything more to say.
I think we've covered the big points. Yeah.
Well, should we close up here then?
Sure. Let's wrap this up.
Okay. So next time, what are we going to be talking about next time?
Okay. So next time, we've decided to look at alternative romantic comedies, alt rom-com.
And what movie have you selected to bring to the discussion?
Well, I thought if we're going to do alternative rom-coms, we should go back to the source. It's arguable whether this was the first alternate rom-com, but a lot of people feel it is. So I say go back to Woody Allen's Annie Hall, 1977.
And I'm going to bring to the discussion Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Oh, good choice. Really good choice. I love that movie.
It's one of my favourites. So join us next time and we'll be having a look at alternative rom-coms. See you soon.
See you then.
And if you want to hear my own attempts at writing a novel, why not check out the Daniel's Nemesis podcast, available on iTunes and other good podcast outlets, and even on YouTube. Links will be found in the description, maybe. After all, any good critic should have first failed in the field that they bitch about. And I also speak a lot more clearly in that podcast.